Jamal's day at school started like any other, with a sense of unease that had become all too familiar. As he walked through the hallways, he couldn't ignore the whispered comments and sideways glances from his classmates. "Look at him, thinking he belongs here," one student muttered to another. Jamal pretended not to hear, but the words stung, reinforcing his feelings of isolation. The comments weren't always whispered. Sometimes they were blatant and cruel. "Hey, Jamal, did you get lost on your way to the hood?" a boy called out, eliciting snickers from his friends. Jamal clenched his fists but kept walking, knowing that reacting would only make things worse. During the lunch break, Jamal sat alone at a table in the cafeteria. From across the room, he watched Sarah, a girl from his history class, join a group of popular students. They welcomed her with smiles and laughter, a stark contrast to the cold shoulder Jamal often received. It wasn't that Sarah was unkind to him. She simply existed in a different social sphere, one that seemed impossibly out of reach for Jamal. As he observed the group, Jamal couldn't help but feel a twinge of envy. It wasn't just about Sarah or any individual person. It was about what they represented: acceptance, belonging, the ease of moving through life without constantly being reminded that you're different. The school day finally ended, and Jamal hurried towards the exit, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere. As he stepped outside, he noticed an elderly white woman struggling to cross the street. Without hesitation, Jamal approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am. Would you like some help crossing?" The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Thompson, gratefully accepted his offer. As they walked together, Jamal felt a small sense of accomplishment. It was a simple act, but it made him realize that sometimes the smallest interactions could make a difference. This brief encounter with Mrs. Thompson left Jamal pondering. In a world where he often felt powerless against the tide of prejudice, here was a moment where he could make a positive impact. It was a reminder that change didn't always come in grand gestures, but in small acts of kindness and human connection. As he continued his walk home, Jamal reflected on the day's events. The hurtful comments, the social divide, and the unexpected interaction with Mrs. Thompson all swirled in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just occurred, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. The following day brought an unexpected turn of events for Jamal and his family. As they were sitting down for dinner, a knock at the door interrupted their meal. To Jamal's surprise, Mrs. Thompson stood on their porch, accompanied by a man in a suit who introduced himself as a lawyer. "Good evening," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice carrying a hint of nervousness. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I have something important to discuss with Jamal and his family." Jamal's parents exchanged wary glances before inviting the visitors inside. Once seated in the living room, Mrs. Thompson revealed her true identity. "I'm not just a helpless old lady," she began. "I was once a civil rights attorney, fighting for equality during some of our country's darkest times." The room fell silent as Mrs. Thompson shared her experiences. She spoke of marches, protests, and courtroom battles. Her voice trembled as she recounted the losses: friends beaten during peaceful demonstrations, colleagues threatened for defending the rights of others. Each word painted a vivid picture of a struggle that, while rooted in the past, still echoed in the present. Jamal listened intently, a new understanding dawning on him. The history he'd learned in textbooks suddenly became real, embodied in the elderly woman sitting before him. He felt a connection to a legacy of resistance and hope that he hadn't fully grasped before. However, not everyone in the room shared Jamal's growing sense of solidarity. His mother, Lisa, sat with her arms crossed, her expression a mix of skepticism and concern. When Mrs. Thompson finished speaking, Lisa voiced her doubts. "I appreciate your history, Mrs. Thompson," she said, her tone measured but firm. "But why are you here? Why tell us all this now?" The tension in the room grew palpable. Mrs. Thompson looked directly at Jamal as she answered, "Because I want to offer Jamal a scholarship for college, a chance to continue the fight for equality in his own way." This announcement sent shockwaves through the family. Jamal's father leaned forward, interested but cautious. Lisa, however, grew more agitated. "And what's the catch?" she demanded. "There's always a catch when it comes to white folks offering help. Mrs. Thompson's lawyer attempted to interject with details about the scholarship, but Lisa cut him off. "We've managed on our own this far," she said. "We don't need charity, especially not the kind that comes with strings attached." Jamal found himself torn. The opportunity Mrs. Thompson offered was beyond anything he'd dared to hope for, but his mother's words struck a chord. Years of experiencing prejudice had taught them to be wary of unexpected generosity, especially from those outside their community. As the discussion continued, the living room became a battleground of ideals, hopes, and deeply ingrained fears. Jamal remained silent, overwhelmed by the weight of the decision before him and the competing voices of opportunity and caution. In the days following Mrs. Thompson's visit, Jamal grappled with the decision to apply for the scholarship. The opportunity was tantalizing, a chance to pursue higher education without the crushing burden of student loans. However, the weight of his family's expectations and his own fears loomed large. One evening, as Jamal sat at his desk staring at the scholarship application, his mother knocked on his door. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "We'll find another way." Her words, meant to reassure, only added to Jamal's internal conflict. At school, Jamal's mind was elsewhere when his history teacher announced a new project on civil rights. As fate would have it, he was paired with Sarah, the girl he'd observed joining the popular crowd. Jamal's heart sank, anticipating awkward silences and half-hearted cooperation. Their first meeting to discuss the project was tense. Sarah seemed uncomfortable, her eyes darting around the library as if she'd rather be anywhere else. Jamal, too, felt out of place, acutely aware of the social gulf between them. As they began researching, however, something unexpected happened. Sarah came across a photo of a young woman at a sit-in, her face set in determination as angry white men shouted at her. "That's my grandmother," Sarah said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of pride and shame. Jamal was taken aback. He'd assumed Sarah's family had always been on the privileged side of history. This revelation forced him to confront his own prejudices. As they delved deeper into their research, they discovered more connections between their families and the civil rights movement. These discoveries brought them closer, but also highlighted their differences. During one session, Sarah made a comment about those neighborhoods when discussing urban poverty. Jamal bristled, pointing out that he lived in one of those neighborhoods. The ensuing argument was heated, with both of them confronting uncomfortable truths about their preconceptions. As the project progressed, so did their understanding of each other. Jamal found himself opening up about the scholarship dilemma. Sarah listened without judgment, offering a perspective he hadn't considered. "Maybe it's not about charity," she suggested. "Maybe it's about continuing the work our grandparents started." Their conversations often veered from the project to more personal topics. Jamal shared his experiences with racism at school, while Sarah admitted to her own ignorance and privilege. These frank discussions were sometimes uncomfortable, but always enlightening. The project became more than just an assignment. It became a journey of self-discovery and mutual understanding. As they pieced together the story of the civil rights movement, they also began to piece together a friendship that transcended their social boundaries. Yet, challenges remained. Some of Sarah's friends made snide remarks about her spending time with Jamal. Meanwhile, Jamal's classmates accused him of selling out. These external pressures tested their newfound connection, forcing them to confront the deeply ingrained prejudices that still divided their community. As Jamal immersed himself in the civil rights project with Sarah, he found himself increasingly drawn to community activism. The stories of past struggles ignited a spark within him, and he began to see his scholarship opportunity in a new light. It wasn't just about his future, it was about making a difference. Inspired by Mrs. Thompson's legacy, Jamal proposed organizing an event to honor her and other local civil rights heroes. Sarah enthusiastically agreed, and they set to work, reaching out to community leaders and fellow students. Planning the event wasn't easy. Jamal faced skepticism from all sides. Some of his classmates questioned why he was stirring up old issues. Others in the community viewed his efforts with suspicion, doubting the sincerity of a teenager's commitment to social change. One afternoon, as Jamal was putting up flyers for the event, he overheard two elderly men talking. "Unity? In this town?" That boy's living in a fantasy world, one scoffed. The words stung, but Jamal pressed on, determined to prove them wrong. Mrs. Thompson became a constant presence in Jamal's life during this time. She shared stories of her past battles, offering guidance and encouragement. Change doesn't come easy, she told him, but it always starts with one person willing to take a stand. As the event drew closer, Jamal's confidence grew. He spoke at school assemblies, convincing even some of the most reluctant students to participate. Sarah used her social connections to bring in supporters from unexpected quarters. However, not everyone was on board. A group of parents complained to the school board, arguing that the event was divisive and political. Jamal found himself defending the importance of remembering history and fostering dialogue. The night before the event, Jamal's doubts resurfaced. What if no one showed up? What if it all fell apart? As he confided his fears to Mrs. Thompson, she smiled and said, "Jamal, the fact that you're willing to try is already a victory. Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already made a difference." Those words stayed with Jamal as he made final preparations. He realized that this event, regardless of its outcome, was shaping him into the leader he aspired to be. It was pushing him out of his comfort zone, forcing him to confront not just the prejudices of others, but his own biases and limitations. As dawn broke on the day of the event, Jamal stood at his window, looking out at the community he hoped to change. He felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. Whatever happened today, he knew it was just the beginning of his journey. With a deep breath, he turned away from the window, ready to face the challenges ahead and make his voice heard. The day of the event arrived, and Jamal's nervous energy was palpable as he arrived at the community center. His heart sank when he saw a group of people gathered outside, holding signs with slogans against diversity and inclusion. Among them, he recognized faces from school and the neighborhood. "Great," Jamal muttered under his breath. "Just what we needed." As he approached the entrance, one of the protesters stepped forward. It was Mike, a former classmate who had dropped out the previous year. "Well, if it isn't the great unifier," Mike sneered. "Coming to teach us all how to hold hands and sing Kumbaya?" Jamal felt his face grow hot, but he kept his composure. "We're here to talk about our shared history, Mike. You're welcome to join us and listen." Mike's face twisted in anger. "Listen to what? More lies about how we're all the same? Wake up, Jamal. This town will never change." The confrontation was drawing attention. Sarah appeared at Jamal's side, her presence a silent support. Other event attendees began to gather, creating a tense standoff between the two groups. Inside the community center, Mrs. Thompson watched the scene unfold with concern. She made her way outside, her frail figure commanding surprising authority as she approached Jamal and the protesters. "Young man," she addressed Mike, "I fought for your right to stand here and voice your opinion. But I also fought for the right of everyone in this community to live without fear or prejudice. Which side of history do you want to be on?" Her words seemed to take the wind out of Mike's sails, but the tension remained thick in the air. Jamal knew he had to act. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, facing both the protesters and the event attendees. "I know we don't all agree," he began, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger. "But that's why we're here today. Not to ignore our differences, but to understand them, to learn from our past so we can build a better future." He paused, looking from face to face in the crowd. "I've lived in this town my whole life, and I've felt the divide. I've been on the receiving end of prejudice, and yes, I've had my own biases too. But standing here today, I see neighbors, classmates, community members. I see people who, deep down, all want the same thing, a fair shot at a good life." As Jamal spoke, he saw something change in the eyes of those listening. Even some of the protesters lowered their signs, their expressions softening. "This event isn't about erasing our differences or pretending everything is perfect," Jamal continued. "It's about starting a conversation. It's about acknowledging our shared humanity, despite our disagreements. So I'm asking you, all of you, to take a step inside. Listen, share. Let's start building bridges instead of walls." A moment of silence followed his words. Then, slowly, people began to move towards the entrance. Some of the protesters remained outside, but others, including Mike, hesitantly followed the crowd in. As Jamal watched people file into the community center, he felt a mix of relief and anticipation. The real challenge was just beginning, but he had taken the first step. He had found his voice, and people had listened. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. Inside the community center, the atmosphere was tense as people from both sides of the divide found seats. Jamal took the stage, his heart racing as he looked out over the diverse crowd. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "Today, we're not here to argue or accuse. We're here to listen and share our experiences." As Jamal opened the floor for discussion, there was initial hesitation. Then, slowly, people began to speak up. An elderly black man recounted his experiences during the civil rights movement, his voice trembling with emotion. A middle-aged white woman shared her family's struggle with poverty and her initial resentment towards affirmative action programs. The stories kept coming, each one revealing the complex tapestry of experiences that made up their community. There were moments of tension, of course. Voices were raised, accusations flew. But Jamal, with support from Mrs. Thompson, managed to keep the dialogue open and respectful. As the event progressed, something remarkable began to happen. People who had entered as adversaries found common ground. A young Latino student and a white factory worker discovered they shared similar fears about job security. A black businesswoman and a white school teacher bonded over their frustrations with the local government's policies. In the midst of this, Sarah stood up. Her voice shook as she addressed the room. "I've always considered myself open-minded," she said. "But being part of this project with Jamal has shown me how much I didn't know, how many assumptions I made without even realizing it." She paused, gathering courage. "I've had to confront my own prejudices, the unconscious biases I carried. It's been uncomfortable and sometimes painful, but it's also been eye-opening. I'm learning, and I'm committed to doing better." Sarah's honesty seemed to break down further barriers. Others began to admit their own biases and misconceptions. The atmosphere in the room shifted from confrontation to introspection. As the event drew to a close, Mrs. Thompson took the stage. Her eyes were moist as she surveyed the room. "In all my years of activism," she said, "I've never seen anything quite like this. What you've done here today, the courage you've shown in opening up to each other, gives me hope for the future." She turned to Jamal, who stood nearby. "And you, young man, your ability to bring people together, to foster understanding in the face of division, that's true leadership. Thank you for reminding an old woman why we fought so hard all those years ago." The event ended with people lingering, continuing conversations in small groups. Jamal watched as former adversaries exchanged contact information, making plans to continue their discussions. As he helped clean up, Jamal felt a profound sense of accomplishment. He knew this was just the beginning, that one event couldn't erase years of division. But it was a start, a crack in the wall of prejudice and misunderstanding that had divided their community for so long. He also realized that he had found his calling. Whatever path his future took, he knew it would involve bringing people together, fostering dialogue, and working towards a more united community. In the days following the event, Jamal rode a wave of positive energy. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the community dialogue, and he received congratulatory messages from people he'd never met. Even some of the initial protesters reached out, expressing a willingness to continue the conversation. Amidst this excitement, Mrs. Thompson requested a meeting with Jamal and his parents. As they sat in the Thompson living room, the elderly woman's expression was serious. "Jamal," she began, "I'm incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. You've shown true leadership potential. That's why I want to discuss the details of the scholarship." She explained that the scholarship wasn't just financial support for college. It came with a commitment, a requirement that Jamal continue his community leadership work throughout his college years and beyond. "We're not just investing in your education," Mrs. Thompson said. "We're investing in your potential to create lasting change in this community." The offer was both thrilling and daunting. Jamal's mind raced with the possibilities and the responsibilities. He'd be able to attend a top-tier university, but he'd also be expected to return home during breaks, to organize events, to be a voice for change. His parents exchanged worried glances. "That's a lot to ask of a young man," his father said. He should be focusing on his studies, not carrying the weight of an entire community. Jamal's mother nodded in agreement. "We appreciate the opportunity, Mrs. Thompson, but Jamal needs to be free to find his own path." As his parents voiced their concerns, Jamal felt torn. The scholarship was a dream come true, a chance to get the education he'd always wanted. But accepting it meant committing to a path he wasn't sure he was ready for. He thought about his friends, about Sarah, about the life he'd built in this town. Leaving for college was already a big step. The idea of maintaining ties, of being responsible for continuing the work he'd started, was overwhelming. "Can I have some time to think about it?" Jamal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Thompson smiled kindly. "Of course, dear. This is a big decision. Take all the time you need." Over the next few days, Jamal wrestled with the decision. He sought advice from teachers, friends, and even some of the people who had attended the community event. Opinions were divided. Some urged him to seize the opportunity, while others cautioned against tying himself down so young. In the end, it was a conversation with Sarah that helped clarify things for Jamal. "You've already shown you can make a difference here," she said. "Imagine what you could do with a college education behind you." Her words resonated with Jamal. He realized that education didn't have to mean abandoning his community. It could be a tool to serve it better. With a mix of excitement and trepidation, Jamal made his decision. He would accept the scholarship and the responsibility that came with it. It wouldn't be easy, balancing college life with community leadership, but he was ready for the challenge. As he shared his decision with Mrs. Thompson and his parents, Jamal felt a sense of purpose settling over him. This was more than just a path to college. It was the beginning of a lifelong commitment to creating change. As the school year progressed, Jamal threw himself into his studies with renewed vigor. His decision to accept Mrs. Thompson's scholarship had lit a fire within him, pushing him to excel not just for himself, but for the community he'd promised to serve. However, this newfound determination didn't go unnoticed or unchallenged. In his advanced placement classes, Jamal found himself under increased scrutiny from some teachers. Mr. Brennan, his AP English teacher, seemed particularly skeptical of Jamal's abilities. During one class discussion on To Kill a Mockingbird, Jamal offered an insightful analysis of the racial dynamics in the novel. Mr. Brennan's response was dismissive. "That's an interesting interpretation, Jamal. Perhaps a bit simplistic, don't you think?" Jamal felt his face grow hot as a few classmates snickered. He wanted to argue but held his tongue, not wanting to be labeled as confrontational. These subtle jabs continued over the weeks, chipping away at Jamal's confidence. He began to wonder if he truly belonged in these advanced classes, if he was really college material. The turning point came during a parent-teacher conference. As Mr. Brennan began to suggest that Jamal might be more comfortable in a standard English class, Jamal felt something snap inside him. "With all due respect, Mr. Brennan," Jamal interrupted, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I've earned my place in this class. My grades are among the top in the cohort, and my analysis has been praised by other teachers. I'm not looking for special treatment, just fair evaluation of my work." The room fell silent. Jamal's parents looked at him with a mixture of surprise and pride. Mr. Brennan, caught off guard by this assertive response, fumbled for words. In the days that followed, Jamal noticed a shift. Mr. Brennan's attitude became more neutral, even respectful at times. Other teachers who had been on the fence about Jamal's abilities now seemed to pay closer attention to his contributions. This incident also caught the attention of his peers. Sarah, who had witnessed the exchange, became a staunch ally. She started to challenge other students when they made dismissive comments about Jamal or other minority students in their advanced classes. As word spread about Jamal standing up to Mr. Brennan, he found unexpected support. Students he barely knew would stop him in the hallway to express admiration for his courage. Even some of the students who had initially been skeptical of his abilities began to see him in a new light. The experience taught Jamal an important lesson about self-advocacy and the power of speaking up. It also reinforced his commitment to using education as a tool for change. He realized that every challenge he overcame, every barrier he broke down, was paving the way for others who would come after him. As college application season approached, Jamal felt a new sense of confidence. He He wasn't just applying for himself anymore. He was applying as a representative of his community, as someone who had promised to return and make a difference. This sense of purpose drove him to pour his heart into every essay, to showcase not just his academic achievements, but his commitment to social change. As the end of the school year approached, Jamal's hard work began to pay off. With Mrs. Thompson's guidance and his own determination, he secured an interview at a prestigious university known for its social justice program. The excitement of this opportunity, however, was quickly overshadowed by an unexpected challenge. One afternoon, as Jamal was leaving the school library, he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. Two students were discussing how someone had been spreading rumors about Jamal's community work, painting it as a publicity stunt for college applications. To his shock, he recognized one of the voices. It belonged to Eric, a former friend who had drifted away when Jamal started excelling in his studies. Jamal confronted Eric the next day, demanding an explanation. Eric's response was a mixture of resentment and jealousy. "You think you're better than us now, don't you?" Eric spat. "With your fancy scholarship and your community leadership. Some of us remember when you were just another kid from the wrong side of the tracks." The argument escalated, drawing attention from other students. Jamal felt a surge of anger and betrayal, but he forced himself to remain calm. "This isn't about being better than anyone," he said. "It's about making things better for everyone." But the damage was done. Over the next few days, Jamal noticed whispers and sidelong glances from his peers. He worried that Eric's rumors might reach the university admissions committee, jeopardizing his chances. Feeling overwhelmed, Jamal turned to Mrs. Thompson for advice. As he poured out his concerns, the elderly woman listened patiently. When he finished, she leaned forward, her eyes filled with understanding and determination. "Jamal," she said, "I've been around long enough to know that no good deed goes unchallenged. What you're experiencing is, unfortunately, a common tactic used to discredit those who try to make a difference." She paused, then continued with a hint of steel in her voice. "But we're not going to let them win. I have some connections at the university, and I think it's time we use them." Over the next week, Mrs. Thompson made several phone calls. She reached out to old colleagues, fellow civil rights activists who had gone on to become influential figures in academia. She arranged for letters of recommendation from community leaders who had witnessed Jamal's work firsthand. Meanwhile, she encouraged Jamal to document his community efforts more thoroughly. Together, they compiled a portfolio showcasing the impact of the events he had organized, complete with testimonials from attendees whose perspectives had been changed. As they worked, Mrs. Thompson shared stories from her own past, times when she had faced similar attempts to discredit her work. "The key," she told Jamal, "is to let your actions speak louder than any rumor. Show them the truth through undeniable evidence of your commitment." Their efforts culminated in a meeting with the school principal and the guidance counselor. Jamal presented his portfolio and addressed the rumors head-on, demonstrating maturity and integrity that impressed the administrators. By the time his university interview arrived, Jamal felt prepared to face any questions about his motivations. The interviewer, it turned out, had received a glowing letter from one of Mrs. Thompson's contacts, which helped to counteract any lingering doubts. As Jamal left the interview, he felt a mix of relief and gratitude. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about perseverance and the importance of documenting one's work. More importantly, it had shown him the power of having strong allies and mentors like Mrs. Thompson. The weeks following Jamal's university interview were filled with nervous anticipation. As he waited for the admissions decision, life in the community took an unexpected turn. Rumors began circulating about a series of small-time drug deals happening near the high school. Concerned parents were up in arms, and tensions in the town were rising once again. To Jamal's shock, he discovered that Eric, his former friend turned rival, was at the center of these activities. It seemed that Eric's resentment had led him down a dangerous path. Mrs. Thompson, ever vigilant, had been quietly gathering information. One evening, she called Jamal to her house. "We have a decision to make," she said gravely. "I have evidence that could put a stop to Eric's activities, but using it would likely destroy any chance he has at a future." Jamal felt torn. Part of him wanted revenge for Eric's betrayal, But another part remembered the friend he used to be. "What should we do?" he asked Mrs. Thompson. "That's not for me to decide," she replied. "This is your community, Jamal. You need to choose the path that you believe is right." After a sleepless night, Jamal made his decision. He approached Eric directly, armed with the evidence Mrs. Thompson had gathered. But instead of threatening him, Jamal offered help. "This isn't you, Eric," he said. "Let's find a way to turn this around." Initially, Eric lashed out, accusing Jamal of trying to play the hero. But as the reality of his situation sank in, Eric's defiance crumbled. In a moment of vulnerability, he confessed to feeling lost and left behind as Jamal and others moved on to bigger things. Together, Jamal and Mrs. Thompson worked to get Eric into a rehabilitation program instead of the juvenile detention center. It wasn't an easy process, and not everyone in the community agreed with their approach. But Jamal stood firm, arguing that real change came from giving people second chances, not just punishing them. As these events unfolded, Jamal's acceptance letter from the university arrived. The joy of his achievement was tempered by the weight of the challenges his community still faced. But he felt more prepared than ever to take them on. On the day of the high school graduation ceremony, Jamal took to the podium as the elected student speaker. Looking out at the faces of his classmates, teachers, and community members, he felt a surge of emotion. "We stand here today, not just as individuals, but as a community," he began. "A community that has faced challenges, disagreements, and misunderstandings. But also a community that has shown the capacity for growth, forgiveness, and unity." He spoke about the lessons he'd learned, the importance of education coupled with empathy, and the power of giving people the chance to change. As he concluded his speech, he made a promise. "As I move forward to college, I carry all of you with me. The lessons we've learned together will shape the way I view the world and the changes I hope to make in it. And I promise to bring those lessons back home, to continue working towards a more united and understanding community for all of us." As applause filled the auditorium, Jamal caught Mrs. Thompson's eye in the audience. She nodded at him, a gesture of pride and a reminder of the journey they had undertaken together. Jamal realized that this graduation wasn't an end, but a beginning, the start of a lifelong commitment to education, justice, and community building.